The heat in Port Tewfik on September 2, 1942, was a physical weight, a shimmering wall of dust and diesel fumes that pressed down on the chaotic docks at the southern mouth of the Suez Canal. For the British stevedores and Egyptian dock workers scrambling across the concrete, the war was not a distant abstraction. It was a thunder rolling just 60 miles to the west, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was grinding the remnants of the British Eighth Army into the desert sand. The logistics of survival had broken down. The docks were choked with confusion, panic, and the debris of a retreating empire. Into this atmosphere of imminent collapse glided a vessel that looked entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye. She was the Seatrain Texas, a freighter of riveted steel painted in drab wartime gray, her single smokestack venting thin exhaust into the stagnant air. She bore the scars of a 13,000-mile solo dash across two oceans, her hull streaked with salt and rust, having outrun every U-boat from Brooklyn to the Cape of Good Hope. To the Nazi High Command, she was just another merchantman, a target to be torpedoed if found, but otherwise a standard component of the Allied supply chain that required weeks to unload and process. The German strategic calculus was cold and precise. They believed they had paralyzed the Allied ability to reinforce North Africa by bombing the heavy-lift cranes and port infrastructure in Tobruk and Benghazi. They understood the mathematics of war better than anyone. Moving a 30-ton tank from a factory in Detroit to a battlefield in Egypt was a nightmare of friction. It required specialized gantries to lift the armor, weeks of disassembly to fit the vehicles into cargo holds, and armies of mechanics to put them back together upon arrival. If you destroyed the cranes, you stopped the tanks. If you stopped the tanks, Rommel took the Suez Canal. It was a logic that had held true for 3 years of war. But as the Seatrain Texas secured her lines and the massive hatches rolled open, the observers on the quay witnessed something that defied the laws of conventional logistics. The ship did not contain crates. It did not contain disassembled machinery packed in grease and straw. As the sun cut into the gloom of the hold, it glinted off the olive-drab armor of 52 M4 Sherman tanks, fully assembled, fully fueled, and sitting on standard-gauge railroad tracks bolted to the deck of the ship. The Atlantic Ocean had effectively become an extension of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Within 48 hours, these war machines would be driving off the ship under their own power, bypassing the ruined port infrastructure entirely and rolling directly toward the front lines. The Germans had prepared for a war of docks. The Americans had brought a floating railroad. To understand how this miracle occurred on a dusty Egyptian dock in 1942, one must look back not to a military boardroom, but to a commercial shipping crisis in the late 1920s. The secret weapon that would eventually save the Eighth Army was born from the mind of Graham M. Brush, an eccentric and visionary shipping executive who was obsessed with a single, maddening problem: the inefficiency of break-bulk cargo. In 1928, the global economy moved by hand. If a factory in Ohio wanted to send heavy machinery to a plant in Havana, Cuba, the process was a torture of redundancy. The cargo was loaded onto a rail car in Ohio. It traveled to a port like New Orleans. There, a gang of 50 stevedores spent days manually unloading the rail car, crate by heavy crate. The cargo sat on the dock, exposed to rain and theft. Then, the same stevedores loaded it into the hold of a ship, piece by piece. The ship sailed to Havana, where the process reversed: unload to the dock, wait, load onto a Cuban rail car, and finally transport to the destination. Every touch point was a hemorrhage of time and money. A ship might spend 3 weeks moving across the ocean and 4 weeks sitting idle in port, burning coal and cash while men moved boxes. Brush proposed a solution that sounded insane to his contemporaries. He argued that the cargo should never be touched at all. The railroad car itself was the container. The solution was to build a ship capable of swallowing an entire train. If you could lift the loaded freight car directly from the tracks and place it inside the ship, you could eliminate the stevedores, the warehouses, the breakage, and the delay. In December 1928, Brush launched the first Seatrain vessel, a strange hybrid of naval architecture and railway engineering built in Newcastle, England. It was a floating parking garage for locomotives. The engineering required to make this work was staggering. A ship at sea is a dynamic, moving object, rolling in the swells and pitching in storms. A train requires absolute stability and rigid tracks. To marry these two hostile environments, Brush designed a massive steel cradle, a movable section of track that acted as an elevator. The system worked with clockwork precision. At the dock, rail tracks extended to the water's edge. A loaded freight car, weighing up to 100 tons, was pushed onto the cradle. A specialized shore-based crane, designed to lift from the bottom rather than the top to avoid crushing the car, hoisted the entire assembly into the air. The cradle hovered over the ship's cavernous hatch, which spanned nearly the full width of the vessel. Inside the hull, there were no open cargo holds. Instead, there were 4 enclosed decks, each laid with 4 parallel sets of standard-gauge railway tracks. The cradle lowered the car to the desired deck, where steam-driven winches pulled the freight car off the elevator and secured it into place. The cradle returned to the dock for the next load. The cycle took minutes, not hours. A process that once required 100 men working for 3 days could now be completed by a winch operator and a small switching crew in less than 24 hours. However, the true genius of the Seatrain lay in its stability systems, features that would later prove critical for transporting tanks. A ship carrying 100 loaded freight cars has a dangerously high center of gravity. In a heavy Atlantic storm, the shifting weight of a runaway locomotive could capsize the vessel in seconds. To prevent this, the engineers devised a triad of restraints that effectively welded the cargo to the hull. First, heavy steel chocks were locked under the wheels. Second, hydraulic jacks were positioned at the 4 corners of each car, lifting the weight off the springs and transferring it directly to the ship's structural frames. Third, steel turnbuckles and chains lashed the car frame to the deck. Once secured, the train became part of the ship's skeleton. The vessel could roll 30 degrees in a hurricane, and the cargo would not move a fraction of an inch. By 1939, the company had perfected the design with 2 new superships built by Sun Shipbuilding in Chester, Pennsylvania, the Seatrain New York and the Seatrain Texas. These were beasts of a different order. They featured a 5th internal deck, requiring a reinforced hull with massive longitudinal girders to support the immense weight. Most importantly, they were built for speed. While the average freighter of the era plodded along at 10 knots, the Seatrain Texas was equipped with high-pressure steam turbines capable of a sustained 16.5 knots. This 40% speed advantage was intended to increase commercial turnover, but in the coming war, it would mean the difference between life and death. When the Second World War engulfed Europe, the United States military watched the Seatrain fleet with keen interest. The tactical implications were obvious to the logisticians in the War Department. Here was a ship that was its own port. It carried its own booms, its own winches, and its own rail yard. It rendered the dockside crane obsolete. Between 1941 and 1942, the War Shipping Administration systematically requisitioned all 5 vessels. The Seatrain New York was converted into the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft transport, proving that the internal rails were perfect for securing fragile airplane fuselages. But the Seatrain Texas retained her original configuration, waiting for a mission that utilized her unique heavy lift capacity. That mission materialized out of catastrophe in the summer of 1942. On the evening of June 20, 1942, in the Oval Study of the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt handed a slip of pink paper to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The message was brief brutal, and devastating. Tobruk has surrendered, with 25,000 men taken prisoner. The color drained from Churchill's face. Tobruk was not just a fortress, it was the psychological and logistical anchor of the British presence in North Africa. Its fall meant that the Eighth Army had collapsed. Intelligence reports arriving in Washington painted a picture of absolute disaster. In the chaotic retreat from Libya into Egypt, the British had lost nearly all their armor. From a force of 300 tanks, barely 70 remained operational to defend the Nile Delta. General Erwin Rommel was unstoppable, his panzers driving hard toward Alexandria. If he took the Suez Canal, he would sever the artery of the British Empire, cutting off the oil of Persia and opening a corridor to link up with Japanese forces in the Indian Ocean. It was the nightmare scenario of the Allied war effort. Churchill, usually the embodiment of defiance, was visibly shaken. He asked Roosevelt for the one thing that could stop the German advance: Sherman tanks. The M4 Sherman was a new weapon, the first Allied tank mounting a 75mm gun capable of destroying German Panzer IVs at combat ranges. The U.S. Army had only just begun issuing them to its own 2nd Armored Division for training. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, made a decision that stunned his British counterparts. He ordered the tanks stripped from American units. He would send the Shermans to Egypt before American crews had even finished learning how to drive them. It was a gamble of supreme strategic generosity. 302 Shermans and 100 M7 self-propelled howitzers were rushed to the port of New York and loaded onto the 6 ships of Convoy AS-4. But in the rush to save Egypt, a fatal logistical error occurred. To protect the precision machinery of the tank engines from the corrosive salt air during the long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, U.S. Ordnance decided to remove the power plants from the vehicles. The engines were crated separately in waterproof containers. In a bid for efficiency, all 402 engines, enough to power every tank in the convoy, were loaded into the holds of a single ship, the SS Fairport. It was a classic case of putting all the eggs in one basket. Convoy AS-4 departed on July 13, 1942, sailing south toward the Caribbean. 3 days later, on a bright afternoon off the coast of Trinidad, the periscope of German submarine U-161 broke the surface. The U-boat commander fired a spread of torpedoes. The SS Fairport was struck amidships. The explosion shattered the bulkheads, and the ship slipped beneath the waves in less than 20 minutes. While the crew largely survived, the cargo did not. 51 tanks went to the bottom, but the true disaster was the engines. All 402 engines were lost. The surviving ships of the convoy were now carrying 251 tanks that were effectively useless sculptures of steel. They could not move. They could not fight. They were 30-ton paperweights steaming toward a war zone that needed them desperately. When the news of the Fairport sinking reached Washington, the despair was palpable. The convoy would arrive in Egypt with tanks that couldn't run. There were no spare engines in the Middle East. Rommel would reach Cairo before replacements could be manufactured and shipped. There was only one option left. The U.S. Army needed a miracle. They needed a ship that could carry a massive load of replacement engines and additional tanks, and it needed to get there fast. It needed to be faster than a convoy. It needed to be faster than a U-boat. The War Shipping Administration looked at its roster and found only one vessel capable of the job: the Seatrain Texas. On July 29, 1942, the Seatrain Texas lay alongside the pier at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. The loading operation was conducted with frantic speed. Into her cavernous hull went 52 fully assembled M4A1 Sherman tanks, locked onto the rails of her lower decks. 25 M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers followed. But the most precious cargo was scattered throughout every available space in the ship. 300 replacement tank engines, crated and lashed down, distributed so that no single torpedo hit could destroy them all. The captain of the Seatrain Texas, Kenneth Towne, was a merchant mariner of the old school, a man of few words and iron nerves. As the loading finished, he was handed a sealed envelope marked Secret. He was instructed not to open it until the pilot had disembarked and the ship had cleared the anti-submarine nets of New York Harbor. When Towne finally slit the envelope open in the solitude of his chart room, the orders were stark. There would be no convoy. There would be no destroyer escort. The Seatrain Texas was to sail alone, relying solely on her 16.5-knot speed to survive. Her destination was Port Tewfik, Egypt. She was to maintain strict radio silence. If attacked, she was not to stop. The British Admiralty had given the mission a code name that reflected the desperation of the hour: Treasure Ship. As the Manhattan skyline faded into the gray mist of the Atlantic, Captain Towne ordered the engine room to bring the steam turbines to full power. The ship began to shudder as the screws bit into the water, surging forward into the submarine-infested darkness. The race for the Suez Canal had begun, and the fate of the war rested on a floating railroad carrying the weight of an army inside its steel belly. The risks were incalculable. A single torpedo would send the top-heavy vessel to the bottom in minutes, taking the last hope of the Eighth Army with it. But as the Seatrain Texas plowed into the swells, her unique internal structure held the tanks in a vice-like grip, steady and immovable, ready for the violence to come. The Atlantic Ocean in August 1942 was not an empty expanse, it was a hunting ground. For Captain Kenneth Towne, standing on the bridge of the Seatrain Texas, the ocean was a vast, hostile chessboard where he was a solitary pawn moving against invisible rooks. The ship ran blacked out every night, a ghost of steel cutting through the phosphorescent waves. Every porthole was dogged down and covered with heavy steel deadlights. The navigation lights were extinguished. Even the glow of a cigarette on deck was forbidden, a tiny spark that could be seen for miles by a surfaced U-boat commander scanning the horizon with Zeiss binoculars. The ship was sailing under strict radio silence, effectively vanishing from the world the moment it cleared the Ambrose Channel. To the Admiralty in London and the War Department in Washington, the Seatrain Texas was merely a projected position on a map, a pencil line inching south at 16.5 knots. To the crew, the voyage was a suspended breath that lasted for 35 days. The decision to sail alone was a calculated gamble based on speed. A typical Atlantic convoy moved at the speed of its slowest member, usually a plodding 8 knots. At that speed, a submarine could easily maneuver ahead of the convoy, submerge, and wait for the targets to cross its sights. But at 16.5 knots, the Seatrain Texas presented a much more difficult geometry. A submerged U-boat, limited to perhaps 4 or 5 knots underwater, could not chase her. To attack, a submarine would have to be positioned perfectly in her path by sheer luck, or it would have to surface and engage on the diesel engines, a risky maneuver against a fast merchantman armed with a stern gun. Towne kept the ship zigzagging, altering course at irregular intervals to frustrate any torpedo solutions being calculated in the depths below. Below decks, the engineering miracle of Graham Brush's design was undergoing its supreme test. In the heavy swells of the South Atlantic, a conventional freighter carrying locomotives or tanks on deck would be rolling violently, the center of gravity dangerously high. Such ships often had to slow down to steerage way in rough weather to prevent capsizing. But the Seatrain Texas rode the swells with an eerie, stable grace. The weight of the 52 Sherman tanks and the thousands of tons of engines and howitzers was distributed deep within the hull, locked onto the rails of the lower decks. The turnbuckles and hydraulic jacks groaned under the strain of the ship's movement, but they held. The cargo was essentially part of the ship's frame. This stability allowed Town to maintain high speeds through weather that would have battered a Liberty ship into submission. They were making time, eating up the latitude lines, crossing the equator and driving hard toward the bottom of the world. The ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope in mid-August, a solitary speck turning the corner of the continent. They put into Durban, South Africa, just long enough to take on fuel oil. The dock workers there, used to the chaotic clutter of tramp steamers, stared at the strange vessel with the clean lines and the massive sealed hatches. There was no shore leave. The mission was too critical. As soon as the bunkers were full, the lines were cast off. The next leg of the journey, the run up the east coast of Africa, was the most dangerous. The Mozambique Channel was a bottleneck, a favorite lurking spot for long-range German U-boats and Japanese submarines operating out of Penang. Here, the Seatrain Texas received her only escort of the entire voyage, a free French corvette, the Commandant d'Estienne d'Ors. The tiny warship, bristling with depth charges and defiance, accompanied the massive freighter through the narrow straits. The French captain, upon signaling the Texas and learning of her cargo, realized he was escorting the most valuable ship in the Indian Ocean. For a few tense days, the corvette buzzed around the freighter like a sheepdog, her sonar pinging the depths. Twice, she peeled off to investigate sonar contacts, dropping patterns of depth charges that erupted in towering geysers of white water. Whether they were submarines or false echoes, Town never knew. He simply kept the throttle wide open. Near Somalia, the corvette signaled a final Godspeed and turned back south. The Seatrain Texas was alone again, facing the final gauntlet, the approach to the Red Sea. As the ship neared Socotra Island, the gateway to the Gulf of Aden, the silence of the radio room was broken by a terrifying sound, the urgent, static-filled chatter of a British distress signal. The message was garbled, broken by atmospheric interference. The radio operator looked at Town with wide eyes. Was it a warning? A trap? A ship going down nearby? Town faced the most difficult decision of his career. If he broke radio silence to ask for a repeat or clarification, his transmission would be picked up by German direction-finding stations. They would triangulate his position instantly, and the Luftwaffe or a U-boat pack would be vectored to intercept. But if the message was a warning about a minefield or a submarine wolf pack directly in his path, ignoring it could be fatal. Town stared at the radio set, the sweat dripping from his brow in the stifling heat of the bridge. He chose silence. He ordered the helm to maintain course and speed. It was a gamble of supreme discipline. Days later, when the Seatrain Texas finally entered the safety of the Red Sea and broke silence to contact British naval control at Suez, the nature of the garbled message became clear. It had been a specific warning. Italian submarine reported in Socotra Channel. Alter course 20 miles north. By the time Town had received the fragmented signal, the Seatrain Texas had already shot through the channel, passing within miles of the waiting submarine. The speed of the vessel had saved her. She had passed the ambush point before the trap could be sprung. On September 2, 1942, the ship glided into Port Tufik. The anchor chain rattled out through the hawse pipe, signaling the end of a 35-day sprint. But the race was not over. The race had just changed form. Now it was a race against logistics. The unloading of the Seatrain Texas was a spectacle that the stevedores of Egypt had never seen. Usually, the arrival of a munition ship meant days of back-breaking labor, swinging nets, and slow, dangerous crane work. But the Seatrain was different. The ship's own heavy-lift booms, rated for 70 tons, swung into action. The hatches were rolled back to reveal the parking garage beneath. Steam winches hissed, cables went taut, and the first M4 Sherman tank was lifted from the internal rails. It was swung over the side and lowered onto the dock. A crew jumped in, the engine coughed to life, thanks to the onboard maintenance, and the tank drove away. then the next one, and the next. There was no assembly required. No tracks to install, no grease to strip. These tanks were combat-ready. Simultaneously, the smaller winches were pulling up the crates of replacement engines. These were the keys to the kingdom. The 300 engines carried by the Seatrain Texas were immediately rushed to the vehicle depots where the 251 engineless tanks from the convoy survivors were sitting like impotent statues. Mechanics began the feverish work of dropping the power plants into the engine bays. In less than 48 hours, the Seatrain Texas was empty. She had disgorged 52 tanks, 25 self-propelled guns, and the mechanical hearts for 300 more vehicles. In 2 days, she had accomplished what a conventional Liberty ship would have taken weeks to do, assuming the port cranes hadn't been bombed by the Luftwaffe. The British Eighth Army, which had been bleeding to death with fewer than 70 operational tanks, suddenly found itself infused with over 300 fresh, heavy American tanks. The strategic shock came on the night of October 23, 1942, at a railway stop in the desert called El Alamein. When General Bernard Montgomery unleashed his artillery barrage, a storm of fire from 1,000 guns, the infantry advanced, clearing lanes through the minefields. Then came the armor. As the sun rose over the desert, the German anti-tank gunners, peering through their sights, expected to see the familiar silhouettes of British Crusader tanks or light American Stuarts, vehicles their 50mm guns could easily penetrate. Instead, they saw monsters. The M4 Shermans came out of the dust, their 75mm guns stabilizing and firing on the move. The German shells bounced off the Sherman's sloped frontal armor. The Shermans returned fire with high explosive rounds that shattered the German emplacements. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been outfoxed not by tactics but by logistics. He was facing an army that had been resurrected from the dead by a single ship. The victory at El Alamein turned the tide of the war in North Africa. It was the beginning of the end for the Axis in the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But few knew that the victory had arrived on a set of floating railroad tracks. The Seatrain Texas had validated a concept that would eventually change the world, though her own story would fade into obscurity. After her frantic dash to Egypt, she returned to the convoy routes, surviving the war to see a strange and varied career. The military retained the vessel, recognizing her unique utility. She did not return to the sleepy run between New York and Havana. Instead, she became a workhorse of American power projection. In the 1960s, the Seatrain Texas and her sister ship, the Seatrain New Jersey, were called up again, this time for the war in Vietnam. The same internal decks that had carried Shermans to fight Rommel now carried M48 Patton tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers to fight the Viet Cong. The ships were old, their hulls tired, but their design remained unsurpassed for moving heavy armor without port facilities. In December 1967, while navigating the Na Bay River near Saigon, the Seatrain Texas struck a Viet Cong mine. The explosion tore a hole in the hull, but the compartmentalized design saved her. She limped into port, unloaded her cargo, and was patched up to sail again. It was a testament to the over-engineering of the Sun shipbuilding yards. However, time and technology were catching up. The revolution that Graham Brush had started, the idea of moving the container rather than the cargo, was being refined by a trucking magnate named Malcolm McLean. McLean realized that you didn't need to move the whole railroad car. You only needed the box sitting on top of it. He invented the modern shipping container, the TEU. By the late 1960s, purpose-built container ships were sliding down slipways, vessels that could carry thousands of containers stacked 10 high. The Seatrain concept, with its heavy rail cars and complex elevators, was an evolutionary dead end, the Archaeopteryx of shipping. a transitional species between the breakbulk freighter and the modern container ship. The company tried to adapt, but the old ships were too slow and too specialized. In 1973, the Seatrain Texas was sold for scrap. The torches cut apart the riveted steel plates that had once held the salvation of the free world. Captain Kenneth Towne never sought the spotlight. He retired quietly, a mariner who had done his job. There were no parades for the crew of the Seatrain Texas. The treasure ship mission was declassified, but it was buried in the mountains of paperwork that the war produced. The history books focused on the generals, Montgomery, Patton, Rommel, and the tanks themselves. The Sherman tank became an icon of American industrial might. But the link between the factory in Detroit and the battlefield in Egypt, the invisible bridge built by a single ship, was largely forgotten. Yet the legacy of that voyage is woven into the fabric of the modern world. Every time you see a massive container ship entering a harbor, stacked high with steel boxes, unloaded by giant gantries in a matter of hours, you are looking at the spiritual descendant of the Seatrain Texas. Graham Brush's insight that the efficiency of the ship depends on the unit of cargo is the foundational principle of globalization. The Seatrain Texas proved that logistics is not just about moving supplies. It is about speed, integration, and the ability to project power across oceans without relying on the enemy's permission or the infrastructure at the destination. The war was won by many things: courage, firepower, intelligence, and industrial capacity. But in the late summer of 1942, the hinge of fate turned on a specific granular calculation. Could 52 tanks cross 13,000 miles of hostile ocean faster than a German field marshal could cross 60 miles of desert? The Germans bet on the desert. The Americans bet on the ocean. The ocean won, because the Americans didn't just send a ship, they sent a system. They sent a railroad that could float, a port that could move, and a weapon that arrived ready to fight. The Seatrain Texas was more than a freighter. She was the proof that in modern war, the most dangerous weapon is often the one that doesn't look like a weapon at all. She was the quiet, gray architect of victory, steaming silently through the night, carrying the weight of the world on her internal rails.